Okay, this lecture is actually the second part of my lecture on sort of opening terms and positional concepts. So let's just move on to the next positional concept. I just finished talking about open, closed, and half-open files and lines. So now let's go over a couple of terms. An open game. So an open game is a type of game that's characterized by many open lines and largely clear of sort of obstructing pawns, usually referring to the center, especially in the opening. And these games tend to be start with E4. And these games are usually very tactical in nature. Okay, so that's one of the characteristics, is that the pawns are gone and there's a lot of open space on the board, or open lines, and you have a lot of tactics. Okay, a closed game is a game that's there aren't many open lines, and the sort of the position is locked with these pawns, and the games tend to be more positional in nature, not very highly tactical. Well, at least in the beginning. And these games tend to start with D4 or Queen Pawn openings. The last category is a semi-open game, and these have sort of like a halfway in between. Between the open and closed, you have sort of some open lines on the board. So let me show you just an example of each, okay, and then we can move on. Actually, the setup that I had earlier showing the open files and lines is a good example of, this is an open type game. Notice there aren't too many pawns in the center. It isn't really locked with pawns, and you can see there's a lot of open lines. I was drawing them all on the board, but here, let me just draw some of them real quick. Let me pause and draw them. So I've paused my thing and drawn the open lines here, or at least half open. Notice how many of them are crisscrossing sort of through the center here, or even the sort of the larger center of the board, where pieces are going to be moving. So when you have open lines, that means your pieces can be moving to all these places. So this is an example of an open game. Let me show you an example of a closed game. Okay, here I've shown an example of an opening, where notice how the center is sort of locked up with pawns, and there are some opening. There's no open files. There are some open lines for the bishops and queens, but notice how none of them actually go through the center. They're all sort of going off to the side of the board. So this is an example of a close position where nothing's really going to go through the center here. Both sides are sort of going to have to attack around the side. So this is an example. Notice how the other example had a lot of lines, and this one has very few. Okay, I use this as an example of a semi-open game. Technically, the Sicilian, which we sort of covered before, I drew the nine-dwarf variation, is a semi-open game where you have few lines. It sort of has characteristic of sort of an open and closed game. In the closed, remember, open they almost were no pawns. In the closed, there are sort of two pawns in the center. Now we sort of have, we have one pawn in the center, and really not. There's somewhat, some closed or half-open files going on, but as you can tell, it's not really open and it's not really closed. If you saw how the pawns were locked and open with the previous two examples. Okay, so hopefully there are some other half-open files, but hopefully you're getting a sense of what this is sort of like a halfway in between situation. Okay, now what I want to cover is just some positional concepts, and maybe I'll try to use this Sicilian position to illustrate what I'm talking about. Here's a few positional concepts. One is piece mobility. That's just the freedom of movement for a piece. So maybe let's just look, and the more mobility you have, the better, because this means you can attack more and defend more. A piece that can't move isn't good at all. So let's look at this Sicilian position and look at various piece mobility. Well, usually, if you don't know, white in the Sicilian has usually very good piece mobility. The knights are pretty well. I mean, they can move to a lot of different squares. That's what I'm talking about. So, maybe, this knight it isn't really going to go there, but it can move to various locations. I mean, not that it would probably move there, but, the knight can move around. Now, this knight it can move, but isn't really, it obviously is not going to move to any one of these squares because it would just be captured. I could come here to this square, but it probably isn't. But if you notice, if you look at pieces, the white pieces, they can move a lot more freely, like the queen can come out. Not that it would probably move to a place where it would be captured, but this bishop can come out. This bishop can come out. There's a lot of flexibility where white's pieces can go. Look at black on the contrary. Well, this knight can get out pretty naturally, but this bishop, I don't know if it really wants to go here. It definitely doesn't want to go here. It can't go there. Can't go there. I don't know if it's very useful here. Okay. And then look at this black bishop. It's not going anywhere for the time being. Then what about black's queen? Well, black's queen can always come out, to one of these squares, but just look at how sort of black's mobility, the places where it can really put its pieces, are not as good as white's. So white has a better sort of mobility. So just going back to my thing, piece mobility is the freedom movement of piece. The more freedom it has, the better off it is. Okay, so like the black bishop, it's not going anywhere, so its mobility is good, and right now it isn't really a good piece. Okay, so getting back now, let's talk about pawn structure. Now, space is the squares controlled by the player, and an advantage in space often leads to a total lack of piece mobility for the opponent, meaning as you move your pawns forward, a lot of times your opponent doesn't have anywhere to put them. So if white keeps moving its pawns up, maybe it moved here and then move this one here. So you notice black, the bishop couldn't get out much. Where's the knight gonna go? Things like this, if white continued like this, geez, where's the queen going to really go? So you can see you're sort of taking over territory, and this sort of leads to where's black army, black army starts being reduced to only moving down here, and white has all this area to move in. Okay, so space is the squares controlled by you, and more space equals no, lack of mobility for your opponent. I just want to say, space is a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing because you don't want to advance your pawns too far, because you got to be able to control that territory. So if you move up all your pawns and you can't control the territory, it'd be like warfare. You take it, but you don't have, you take over a town, but you don't have enough men to actually hold the fort or hold the town. So when you can gain space and control it, that's great. Okay, now what about pawn weaknesses? Well, pawn weakness, technically a weak square, I just want to talk about weak squares. A weak square is any square that can no longer be controlled by pieces, especially a pawn. And usually it refers to a pawn. Now, technically, it's, when it's a pawn, we're only talking about sort of between sort of these four ranks, because since the pawns start down here. So now technically, like this square here in black's camp can no longer be controlled by a pawn. Therefore, white may want to try to, put its knight right here, because, a pawn can't chase it away. Okay, this is only really the weak square right now in black's camp is this B6 square. But so technically you can lose control over a square when you don't have enough pieces to guard it, but usually refers to a pawn, and a lot of times these are called holes. So this is an example of a hole, meaning this is somewhere to where a pawn can no longer control. So you want to watch that. So squares that can't be controlled anymore, especially by pawns, are weak squares. Okay, and those are sort of, you think about it, you may want to, that's the best place to put your piece. You know, if you can't be chased away by a pawn, or that's somewhere you can put a piece and it can't be driven away, isn't that a great place to put it? You know, something, it's almost like a sniper almost, you know, wherever you can put them up there and control everything. Well, that about does it for some positional concepts.